Hello everyone, today we talk about Ostrogothic archers and more specifically foot archers, but not only, because we will see that the topic is actually broader and we have to distinguish in fact two phases that maybe you can get a bit acquainted with if you have never gotten interested in the Ostrogoths or the so-called Ostrogoths, like between the settling down in the Ukrainian steppe and the creation of the Italic kingdom, right? These are two distinct moments in between of which there is the Hunnic domination of the so-called Ostrogoths, also known as Tervingi actually, but even ethnonyms here are complicated, so for the sake of simplicity we will simply call them Ostrogoths at this point, always bearing in mind that these were actually pretty fluid groups that I'm personally convinced did maintain a kind of cohesion based on the political and kind of juridically ethnic character. That this is effectively what distinguishes people in that sense at this point. Naturally, the history of the Ostrogoths in the Ukrainian steppes is kind of important because they settled into an area that was inhabited by former populations that won't probably they mixed a lot, but we don't know actually in which relation. And I'm making all of this premise because naturally there is also horse archery, and in the case of the Ostrogoths we used to say that essentially they were among the so-called Germanic peoples those who made more extensive use of archery and of horse archery because they were acquainted with Eastern populations such as the Sarmatians that at this time basically, get torn apart by this Germanic and eventually the Hunnic migrations, and they enter to be part of these peoples as well, and bringing to them actually all of these zootechnical and military traditions that objectively are quite fitting the picture we get, even archaeologically speaking, from these Ostrogothic warriors, right? But it's as if this phase was, relatively obscure. We know the Ostrogoths managed to create this solid kingdom on the Black Sea that they used also as a base to launch raids, etc. Actually, that wasn't that difficult from what the Scandinavians would do during the Viking era in Russia, right? And raiding also Black Sea, the Aegean Sea, etc. So that's a terribly interesting period in history. I made a video about the Ostrogoths. If you go in the Migration Era playlist, you find sometimes this series that I've done about the peoples of the Migration Era, right? And we discussed extensively about them. So I give you that as a broader introduction. But it's still important to stress today the separation objectively that exists between that phase, right, in pre-Hunnic times, and the later phase of the Kingdom of Italy, because basically in the meanwhile, in the mid of it, we don't know a great deal about the Ostrogoths, that in the meanwhile in fact were under the Huns, like other Germanic populations such as the Longobards that we will have to discuss today, because there is objectively a continuity in Italy between the Ostrogoths and the Longobards, also in military traditions, and that can be quite helpful in many ways. Also with the Visigoths that were technically, very akin to, they were Goths, or they were identified as such. Once again, here we don't have time to go in detail with actual ethnic identity, but you understand this because, as a matter of fact, also archaeologically speaking, militarily speaking, these peoples were pretty much the same, right? When I make videos like this, and I say that essentially, let's take a look to this specifically Ostrogothic archers, if it was something on its own. Well, it's not really that wargamistic. We have to assess that here an Ostrogothic archer was basically the same identical thing than an Alemannic archer, or even a Scandinavian archer for that, we know. But we can see among the Goths and the Ostrogoths particularly these apparent higher, let's say, more marked character of horsemanship and archery than in other peoples. Maybe just the Longobards can compare in that regard. In this, of course, today we stop with the Ostrogoths at the mid 6th century when they got wiped out by the Byzantines, but the concept is that objectively there is a continuity later as there has been before, right? The reason that I stress also the parenthesis of the Hunnic domination is quite important, because as a matter of fact we do know that the Goths were quite praised by the Huns. The Huns had a great opinion of this subject of theirs among all the other Germanic peoples and others, of course, that they had. And we know that the Ostrogoths fought, for example, at Battle of the Catalaunian Fields, right? From the Hunnic side, there were the Ostrogoths. From the Roman side, there were the Visigoths, which is quite fascinating. That has always struck me since I was a child. And but it's important because that tells you how circular, in some ways, certain military traditions and practices and skills were at the time, right? And this is a fate that the Ostrogoths, in terms of poor documentation in that period, share, in fact, with the Longobards, with this broader area of Central Europe, where a lot of things happen, but that we can't really focus because we don't have documentary sources. Fundamentally, we have archaeology, but archaeology, as I always say, does not have tags. So basically, we can't say who's who, for example, within the Germans, right? Hunnic stuff is usually kind of more recognizable. Maybe Iranian stuff is more recognizable. I mean, you can tell with a Sarmatian theoretically, and always bearing in mind that, of course, even in terms of material culture, these peoples shared a freaking lot of stuff, right? You can't say, there are so many iconic, even in modern representation of weapons or helmets. Think about the Niedersachsen helmet, or think about the Francisca. I mean, we have been discussing this in the migration era, and we realize that there is, aside from literary traditions, there is not actually a concrete material continuity in that regard. These weapons and armor and tactics and concepts, generally speaking, were largely shared. But there is the broader discussion here in saying also how much of this was actually not maybe Iranic or Hunnic, but how much was it Roman, for example? I mean, the Germans had been gravitating around the empire for centuries at this point, and the Goths actually along the Danubian frontier were they were a thorn in the side for the Romans. And they entered prepotently, especially the Visigoths, fleeing from the Huns in the empire with the Battle of Adrianople and all these stories, etc. The Ostrogoths basically settle in the space that had been loosely left, free by the Visigoths in today's, essentially in the Carpathians, but also in the Danubian area. Actually, a pretty vast area that arrived up to the I think the Bavarian Alps or something like that. And it was enormous also because these peoples were many. They weren't probably among the so-called Germanic populations that the loosest from an ethnical point of view were exactly the Ostrogoths, and especially at this point, I mean, after the Huns that had been an avalanche over these peoples that, as far as I can understand, I mean, when they settled in the Ukraine, still had a kind of a, if not a markedly Germanic character, which in itself doesn't quite mean much objectively, but let's say a cohesion of what they had been before, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that at the time of the migration in Italy, they were much less German or Central European, Northern European, whatever you want to call it, than they had been when they settled faring east over the Carpathians in the Ukrainian plains. This is important because that's what confirms what would explain more macroscopically and structurally the fact that objectively the Ostrogoths really do display this more markedly chivalric, we can say, equestrian, say better, character, and also archery. There weren't two arms particularly developed among the early Germans, what we call the early Germans. So it's important to split the two parts, in my opinion, and starting with the beginning, like the Tervingi, the Ostrogoths in the Ukraine, were obviously pushed to, entering the steppe, to adapt to the environment, right? The environment doesn't quite shape politics or military like geopolitics does not exist objectively. So there were naturally some traditions that they brought from where they came from that had the particular political and social organizations. These other peoples around their nomadic or semi-nomadic didn't quite have the same measure, but they also adapted to the terrain, right, to the areas, and engaged in other things that on average they hadn't been doing in Germany, wherever they came from that matter. So we do know, however, that the Ostrogoths at that point took the horse with enthusiasm, right? We can't think, of course, of the cooptation and other forms of integration of the same Iranian nobility that taught these guys what in Germany wasn't quite practiced so intensively. About this, there could be further debating. Let's say even the etymology of these peoples seem to suggest, of the name of these people seems to suggest things that, for example, I don't know, the Visigoths, the Vesi, were kind of inhabiting more the forests towards the 4th century, right? And these other Ostrogoths were, from the eastern side, from this area of the rising sun, of the fertile plains that they occupy, the pastures they needed. And generally speaking, that the Goths fit in what is considered by any standard the eastern, and in the case of the Ostrogoths, the easternmost Germanic branch. So you can't speculate that technically, even in Germany, there could be a pre-existing differentiation between the Western Germans, let's say the ones of the forests of the Northwest, and these other guys from the East, that technically speaking were in what we think was essentially today's Poland territorial speaking, such as other peoples that also took different directions. For example, the Vandals, right, that allegedly were in fact Germanic as such, but probably they evolved also from kind of a Celtic and even Proto-Slavic background. But instead of going east, they dwelled around there for a while, the Danube. Then eventually they went west in Gaul, Spain, and Africa eventually. And so you realize that these peoples at the beginning were kind of similar, right? And we can say that in this eastern part of Germany there were on average, let's say more flatlands than there was in Western Germany, at least not forested ones. It's a bit speculative because even territories such as the one of Poland that were pretty forested at the time, I suppose. They aren't easy territories when you can make this dramatic use of cavalry and open spaces, etc. But this doesn't mean at all, of course, that these guys didn't know cavalry. We know the Germans knew, like any other Indo-European people knew, since they had settled in Europe, and just it wasn't terribly developed, right? The early Germans are often stereotyped like just a lot of infantrymen, right? And even archery, there is a big debate about it as well, like how much was it spread? Like, it's not that in these times we can simply rely on archaeological finds to claim a quantitative, the evidence of a quantitative dimension. There are very interesting things actually we can get archaeologically speaking from the migration here. We do realize there was an evolution. There was even an enrichment of these peoples, because objectively the more they fared south or east, they basically subdued other populations. They became wealthier, at least the freemen. The swords became more frequent, armor more frequent, and seemingly even archery, right? Archery is probably deeply overlooked actually in the importance that it had also in the ancient world. It's just we don't know much, but at least in the sources of the late Roman late antiquity, let's say, we know that these peoples had gotten in a way or another consistent number of archers, and these were essentially they used self bows of moderate strength. I mean, it wasn't anything particular. Possibly, of course, that there were certain injections, let's say, of other kind of the Hunnic bow, etc. But maybe we'll discuss that on another occasion. we don't see a terrific enhancement of bow types, especially among the Germans, right? One thing is among the Hans proper first, but especially among the Avars later. That's well another story. But at that time, the Goths are either from the other side of Europe or extinguished in Italy, right? So the important thing here is that they simply used archery, and that's pretty and that it was pretty widespread. And this is really natural if you consider of all the peoples that on the previous archery traditions that had existed in the area that actually was pretty wide. It didn't encompass just the steppes, right? Technically it followed them, but even peoples like the Getae, for example, in the Balkans, today's Romania roughly, but that the steppes arrived up to Hungary in Europe. So it was this great corridor passing through essentially the Danube Delta and going up the river up to the Pannonian Plains, that had always seen a great development of archery. Even Thracians, the Danubian Thracians were famous for their archery, etc. So that's an area that had always required, and that had, say better, had fitted populations that were used to fight in that way. And it's obvious that the Germans arrived there. We don't know how many they were, but whichever their archery tradition was before, it was dramatically enhanced at the contact with these populations. And in the case of the Ostrogoths, probably more than any other people. Some say, that there are a lot of approximations when people, for example, don't find a specific evidence about when people, for example, there is this idea that the Vandals didn't make a great deal of horse archery. How can this be proven factually is beyond my comprehension. Like, it's obvious that there were peoples that tended to make more or less use of that, but here there is not a single people in Europe or the Mediterranean that didn't make use of these troops. The problem is in which quantity, and we lack the quantitative data, but also we have, or at least the only ones we have is the, let's say, incidence of frequency, let's say better, of references to this in the sources, right? And of course, if a source says that people made greater use of this stuff than others, that's all we have. We have to stick to it with all the legitimate doubts, which is what we are essentially looking at today and trying to make some further hypotheses, right? And the idea also about the Germans is that, originally speaking, they weren't a particularly affluent people. They migrated largely because they lived in places that couldn't sustain them anymore. And albeit the improvement that objectively happened in so many fields, think about metallurgy, right? In the late antiquity passes from the traditional Noricum in today's Austria to the upper Rhineland for most of the early Middle Ages, actually. These populations during migration era, just as others, telling the truth, including the one they mixed, didn't make a terrific use of armor. They weren't particularly rich, right? So there is nothing to be surprised of. Even Byzantine soldiers in Italy, for example, used during the Gothic War, they used wooden armor, for example, which is still better than nothing, actually, and it's pretty functional in some ways, and cheap especially. So the more we go, especially towards the 6th century and the pandemics and the demographic contraction and all the collapse of the major Mediterranean and European trades, you realize that even actual goods and assets are dramatically important, even just to keep an army. In fact, armies were regularly small, right? And the Ostrogoths actually were a fairly big people when they migrated from the Illyricum in Italy, but they were still, we don't think, more than 100,000, around that, like, and just 1/4 of them being fighters in a way or in another. So just a couple of tens of thousands of actual fighting forces, right? And during the migration era, these peoples weren't faring better than the sedentary ones that suffered their invasions, right? They, on the contrary, like they settle among those because they were wealthier, right? And all the demographic strength of these peoples was also kind of a weakness because they weren't many, and this gave a lot of problem to them when they actually eventually settled down in these areas that were instead densely populated, still with millions of people, to effectively control them and to manage a world that they had kind of not directly interacted with in that fashion, at least before, and lots of other problems, including the organization of the army, which was a big deal, but not because of a contrast with the local population. On the contrary, it was mostly an internal political problem of the elites, because there was always, a part that wanted to get Catholic and Romanized for their own interests, the other that wanted to remain Aryan, read pagan, and kind of still Germanic-like politically, in terms of political culture, from the other, and this created a lot of instability. It happened for the Goths in Italy, chiefly at that point, however, in relation with the Roman elites that up to a certain point had coexisted dramatically well. In fact, the Ostrogoths had the most successful achievements in coexistence between Romans and Germans in the 6th century. Unfortunately, the Byzantines came, but also, the solidity of the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy wasn't that great towards the end, and the actual Gothic War proved it, right? And the same goes for the Vandals. In part, this is true for the Visigoths, but they were too far from, other opponents to be wiped out. Eventually, the Arabs would do it, but, two centuries later. And then these are shared problems. They're just certain particular peoples and dynasts surpassed, read the Franks, chiefly speaking, but also the Longobards in part that were lucky enough to have arrived in Italy at that point with a situation was very, very different from the one that the Goths had acquainted at the beginning. So there is let's say a great there is consensus, let's say, on the fact that, of course, generally speaking, already these armies weren't particularly armored, right, and they were fairly poor materially speaking. Well, the archers, traditionally speaking, are fundamentally light troopers, right, whether they are horse archers or foot archers. In great part, they are some of the cheapest units you can find. In the sense that these peoples knew essentially how to use the bow, especially when they lived in the steppes and in other wild areas of Central Europe or the Balkans that had not been Romanized. And therefore, you could coerce them just in large numbers because, having bows and arrows is fairly cheap. Arrows are not that cheap, and in fact also the availability of firepower on the field was quite important in that regard. Also logistically speaking, because these peoples were renowningly, not particularly organized, centralistically speaking, so they had also certain limitations on the field in bringing a certain amount of stuff, and especially remaining on the field in campaign for long. But of course, there were elite troops. We'll see it later that actually in Ostrogothic Italy, we know of elite archers that were trained by Theodoric. There were other things like this, but generally speaking, the archer in this context is always like that, and it is such a light trooper, even in the steppes, where that kind of craft is mastered in terms of horse archery. And of course, even in there are elites, right? And this is why now we will observe also what it means. Like, not all horse archers are actually the same thing, and especially they're not just horse archers, and this is quite important. But there is a lot of debate rather on the quantity, like how many people were actually either horse archers and especially foot archers, because we get the distinct impression that albeit these peoples were so mixed with the Easterns, etc., we don't know by which degree. I tend to see it as well, as actually many scholars tend to see that, and I just follow them because, but to me it does make sense on the evidence that we have, is that actually these armies were pretty, pretty Germanic looking anyway. Like, there is this idea that they were so-called Reitervölker, right, and they were essentially all horsemen, and they fought prevalently on horseback. And there is a phase objectively in the that is difficult to explain whether it pertained to the actual steppes legacy, or it was a political and social segmentation consequence when these guys had settled down eventually within the Romanic Germanic kingdoms. But objectively, there were lots of these fighters that fought on horseback, right? Or also that came on the field on horseback and dismounted to fight, which is a distinction that even doesn't make sense, because technically that has always happened, right? And in this period especially, it wasn't a dramatic social certification for which there could be an ultra elite that did just one thing. Like, if you take even in medieval times, let's say in full medieval, low medieval times, when there is the ultra heavily armored elite, still those guys, they're conceived to fight on horseback, to carry out shock charges and so on. But essentially, they fought still in every single type of soldier, like a fighter. There is no distinction we can make, so sharply in this regard. But it seems during the migration era that the horsemanship was so widespread among these peoples that, in fact, it doesn't even make sense a lot to distinguish them in this sort of tactical functionalization or specialization. Yet, horses also are a big asset. Like, you can't think that all of these guys actually owned horses, or that they were essentially all the same on the field. We know that probably they all knew how to ride a horse, but not necessarily all had the necessary gear to fight, let's say, more conveniently on horseback all the time than on foot. And as a matter of fact, I personally believed, like it's historiographically accepted at this point, that the large majority of these Germanic armies, even in the case of the easternmost ones like the Goths, were fundamentally foot armies, right? And that cavalry had definitely an important role, and actually a very important one, but still it was subordinated substantially to the one of infantry. And there is all a political problem in this all, because especially in these easternmost branches, there was an attempt, actually I would say specifically in the case of the Ostrogoths, to essentially to give an attempt from the side of aristocracies that you find also in other Germanic peoples to, of course, become more powerful and extend their power over the freemen, right? In the poorest areas of Europe, this couldn't happen so easily, because the freemen remained the bulk of the population, and therefore they were strong enough by themselves as footmen. At this point, also for reasons of military technology, cavalry wasn't the thing that it would become later on, right, with the Franks in the 8th century. That would counter the rise of the aristocracies. In the case of these peoples that remained, especially under the Hunnic domination, is that there was a more developed verticization of society. In certain German groups, it succeeded by a certain extent, even about after the shipwreck, let's say, that the Ostrogoths suffered with the same fall of the Hunnic empire, because they contributed to make it disgregate, but at a point in which they weren't probably that particularly cohesive like they had been before. There is among the Longobards that seemingly during the Hunnic domination had their aristocracies at one point taking even the same Hunnic suffix in the name to be more appealable in front of the masters, but that they were overthrown eventually by the freemen, the middle class that didn't want that, and in that sense embodied more strictly the ancient, we can say, Germanic traditions. These peoples were it's obvious that the more society is stratified, the easiest, the most consequent it gets to get kind of heavier cavalry. Maybe not dramatic numbers, but still a component on the field that can make the difference in terms even of shock charges, etc. Because this, there wasn't a stirrup, there weren't even, but this doesn't mean anything. Cavalry has always charged, and there was still a kind of a overwhelming force on the field. Of course, a determined and solid infantry could repel cavalry charges easily at that point. That essentially in Western warfare was eclipsed just between the 12th and especially the 13th century, but it was an exception. Like, we tend to see that as the Middle Ages, but it wasn't quite like that, telling the truth. So the interesting thing is that you can observe within the Ostrogothic aristocracy greater wealth, and consequently this sense that these were fewer people that owned a consistent amount of wealth, and this was maintained over time because also the migration in itself, telling the truth, even after the Hunnic parenthesis, brought the need of having a leader, of someone who could guide and organize these peoples, right? It was a dramatically difficult enterprise for those times, and they did an amazing job overall. And this process facilitated naturally also the rooting of the Ostrogoths eventually in Italy, as not just as a people but essentially as an elite leading the people, right? And kind of being framed and integrated essentially as the army within the Italian society, whereas the Roman senators were still in charge of the civil administration. And the greatness of the Ostrogothic Italy is that you don't find it anywhere else, is that in spite the Ostrogoths remained Arian and kind of part of the army, and the senators remained Catholic and doing performing civilian functions. They appeared in front of the same consistorium of Ravenna at the presence of the king, right? So this was of dramatic importance. Theodoric was an Arian, but the first thing he does when he seizes power in Italy from Odoacer is to go to the Pope and revere him, and Roman senators as well, because they understood pretty damn well that Italy, that hadn't been destroyed yet by the various crises that had come up to that point, needed the support of the locals, because it was impossible to rule such a big system, such a productive and still functional thing, without this cooperation. By the way, the Goths had been sent there by the same Constantinople on behalf of the Roman Emperor to rule, like, in that regard. So now we can't make the story of the Ostrogoths in Italy. We will make other videos about them, but the concept here is that there is a passage that sees the Goths basically becoming the Italian army, in the sense that they first of all, they were settled by Theodoric in areas that were of strategic importance. Chiefly the Po Valley was militarized, and the most important Apennine passes, whereas the coasts remained kind of more connected to their civilian dimension and the context with Constantinople. So this, for a while, naturally maintained a strictly military character of the Ostrogothic settlement, but we know that these things do not last. The population gets mixed with these people, and eventually there are ties that are important, because the divisions at that point do not become any more kind of ethnic on a juridical base, because technically speaking the Romans had their own law, the Germans had their own, so that they functioned as two distinct systems, even from a civilian point of view, right? It wasn't just a matter of the army. It was still the Goths conceiving themselves as the Gothic people, temporarily or permanently, but however still distinctively settled in Italy within the Roman population, right, as a separated thing. This, at the end of the day, becomes kind of a more political division, right, that will emerge more clearly as in other Romano-Germanic kingdoms. In the case of the Ostrogoths, with the death of Theodoric and the malaise that started being felt because the Roman senators wanted the actual Roman government back, and certain Goths probably wanted that too in part, others wanted to remain with the harsh line. There was the religious problem as well in the most Catholic country in the West. So it was an interesting picture that makes you understand that, of course, there were also political and social changes over time. And the Goths had seized at that point the same military administration. I mean, they had seized the Roman fabricae that were still functional at the time, and they were equipped actually with Roman equipment, Roman armament. They manned fleets, siege weapons, and so on. Not with terrific success, actually, as the Gothic War would prove against the Byzantines. But there is a bit of cliche there, probably too, in my opinion, in Procopius. But the point is that at this point, the picture of the Gothic army becomes the one essentially of a Roman army. Like they retain their own characteristics, but trying to make to draw a sharp distinction between, I don't know, the Goths fighting in the Gothic War and the Byzantines at that point is probably not excessively helpful. And in fact, that's where we have the problem of, since we know that during the Gothic War there was a lot of archery involved, where did that stem from, right? It's not that we have sources of, what Theodoric's army was in the Illyricum, in the Balkans. We don't know that. We don't know how many archers they had at the point. We don't know how many archers they had a generation afterwards during the Gothic War in Italy. All we know is that apparently there is this continuity in horse archery and in archery in general that is more marked within the Ostrogoths than other peoples. All right. Now there is this point also, of the relation with the Roman tactics and armament. Like, first of all, the original Gothic archer would be simply a guy with bow and quiver and with a knife, right? That's literally it. First of all, who were these people? Because that's also important. Like, as we will see later, we realized that the archers were the lower strata of the populations. Many of the population, many of them weren't actually even freemen, right? There were lots of serfs, of slaves that the Germans collected along the way, and that could be adopted at one point, freed, or becoming some sort of semi-free individuals, eventually absorbed by the population. Also in this chapter there is a huge literature. The most interesting story is once again one of the Longobards in this specific case. But let's say that also archery was had become a symbol of this sort of tough duty that objectively archers have, especially when they're kind of throwaway like troops that have their own importance in open field, but they're used also as explorers and skirmishers and scouts and whatever, and that's risky, and they actually carry out at that point some of the riskiest tasks ever, right? But even on battlefield, actually in pitched battles, they don't have it dramatically easy, as we will see. And naturally these troops as such were the lightest probably you could find ever. We don't know how many there were. Like, we don't know whether there were 1/3, 1/5. Some people say actually that these foot archers during the migration era of these peoples on the march weren't terrifically much. Like, they weren't a major force like you can find, for example, in the steppes peoples. And I think it's fairly accurate. I mean, I doubt that these guys surpassed in number the amount of foot freemen, right? I think they were just a complement like you find in other medieval contexts, like you don't find in the West, armies composed overwhelmingly by archers, if not maybe during the 14th century English armies, where you get there for doctrinal reason an enormous amount of archers that have to create the volume of fire. It's not actually about the power of the longbow in that case, but actually the enormous amount of archers shooting at the same time. And I think so that in this context they were kind of similar to this. I mean, they were a complementary force, and probably horse archers were more prized, right? Because horse archery is dramatically useful in many situations, especially for outflanking the enemy and harassing him on from the rear, etc. With bow. That's lethal. So probably horse archers were on average more costly, if anything, because they fight on horseback. So a serf, a slave especially, wouldn't have a horse, so traditionally speaking, we see even in those areas in the Balkans, in the ancient world, among the Jedi, that the horse archery was for freemen at that point. So this is probably the same like here, like in areas that had been dominated. In fact, look at the Jedi, the Scythians, the Sarmatians. Well, the Ostrogoths arrived, and probably they started doing the same exact thing, right? But for what concerns foot archers, I mean, horse archers specifically are probably even more difficult to quantify than foot archers, because more or less you can expect all armies of the time being surrounded by foot archers of some sort, of some quantity. This was true actually also in the Roman legions, that had a dramatic offensive and defensive firepower that Roman legions in previous centuries had never had. Right, and this is something that is disgustingly overlooked. That everybody thinks that actually maximum firepower Roman legions were in the early Roman Empire. That's absolutely inaccurate, right, by any standard. So these were also threats that the Goths had to defend them from, right? Themselves from. They had met definitely the Romans on the frontiers, and other peoples from the steppes that fought in that way. And we do know that it's that easy and that quick to actually adopt those tactics, like it happened in many, many other contexts, right? And after all, we can't think that horse archery was practiced even in Germany, as far as we know. Actually, we do know that. We know Frankish cavalry during the 6th century, I think, using horse. And that's obvious, because guess what? Every single freeman can, let's say, ride a horse and use a bow on average, right? So you can imagine the aristocracy that also spends all his non-war time doing other war in the form of either, other war, because that's literally what happened, but especially also hunting, right? So everybody can, and actually every single heavy cavalryman kind of knight that has ever existed throughout all the Middle Ages knew absolutely perfectly how to use a bow on horseback. Now this sticks to the individual side of the story. Now the collective one is a bit different, right? Especially when you have a certain level of tactical specialization, like it happened in knightly, in medieval times, that at that point makes, has to bring you to make a choice, right? At this time, as we have seen before, there is not still this kind of differentiation, so we can expect literally that every horseman could fight with a good level of expertise on horseback, as much as every infantryman, with a bow altogether, right? The problem was getting among these peoples actually a collective training, right? This is the dramatic difference that probably is the only one existing at different levels between these peoples and, say, the Romans, professional permanent military that basically spent a lifetime just being a professional of war. The Germans weren't dramatically far from that, in the measure in which they were militarized by the needs of the migration. Objectively, these peoples out there were just constantly struggling for survival and competing with each other, and there were probably massacres of biblical proportions that we don't even know about, but that took place there. Nobody recorded, but that was tough, and these guys in fact stuck together, and you can't see the migration here as a big filter, big heartless trial and test for which only the stronger won. And was the stronger is the one who is more politically cohesive, right? And this can happen in different ways. It usually passes through a good wealth distribution. Like the migration era proved that essentially those peoples who had a stronger middle class were more cohesive because they had kind of more interests in common at a horizontal level, and therefore they were more compact when it came to take a decision, right? And these peoples were kind of famous, the Germanic ones, for their sense of freedom, but of egalitarianism. That also the Strategikon that we will talk about later actually describes them like. And at the same time was, however, such a pressure, a metus hostilis, that brought these peoples to stick together and to compensate this lack of centralized training of enforced coercive discipline just by this kind of fanatically heroic mindset that would bring these guys actually to get themselves killed, right? But there was effective also. If you wonder where the terrible Germanic charges came from, well, that is actually the unrationalized solution for smashing essentially the enemy at one moment, because essentially these guys couldn't do much more than that, collectively speaking. They couldn't perform complicated maneuvers. They couldn't stay on the field for long. So it was obvious that the barbarians fighting on foot, like sedentary peoples on average, like the Celts, like others, would do this against their opponents. And actually, the Roman army coped effectively with Germanic infantry and also cavalry charges. Actually, the Romans, as the Strategicon says, didn't. I mean, they feared more infantry charges from the side of the Germans than actual cavalry charges, because the latter apparently were more disorderly than infantry ones. And this is probably about the fact that there were a few elite cavalrymen that also were quite jealous about their clan of belonging. They didn't like to cooperate much with each other, while the middle-class infantry kind of stuck more together. Even if there were, clans as well, they were more numerous, and they knew each other, were kind of family to each other. They had this sense of revenge that they had to, that had to keep them together, even preserving each other, defending each other in the field. And that's how they compensated for the lack of a collective training that the state couldn't give them, simply because they didn't have a state, unlike the Romans had. So this is the concept. There is this idea that the Byzantines objectively were capable of defeating considerably larger numbers, for example, the Vandal or Ostrogoth cavalry. And many people have, come up with certain theories, like why was that? How qualitatively superior was Byzantine cavalry to these guys? Well, the question is difficult to answer, because we don't know this enormous much about the Byzantine army either. And albeit we do, my impression is that there is that I've said on several occasions that there wasn't actually an enormous difference in the tactical, let's say, specialization of these troops. I explain myself better. Like, there is this idea that essentially the Byzantines trained, and which is true, that's telling the truth, they trained for an extremely long time their own cavalry. They taught them how to use every single kind of weapon and whatever. And this is seen as a proof of the fact that these troops were superior to others. Essentially, a Germanic cavalryman would do exactly the same thing, except they didn't need to be enforced to do that, because they were required to do it anyway throughout all their lives. Maybe this is an overestimation, but if you consider it like this from both sides, there was not this terrific difference. The equipment actually was similar to one another, and that's why actually there wasn't a great difference in terms of equipment. The real difference, as we said before, was the collective side of the story. The Byzantine cavalrymen performed this collective training way more than the Germans did, and that's effectively what made difference. It's not about the fact that the Byzantines were allegedly equipped with lance and bow, and the Germans not, right, on horseback. They probably were quite the same thing. And also for a Byzantine equipped in that way, either there was an enormous logistical system behind it that could support it, but the structures of, think about Belisarius in Italy. I mean, yeah, they had Africa and Sicily at their back. They had supplies from the Balkans as well. But the concept is, if you look at the armies on the field, they're not dramatically different. They aren't doing dramatically different thing. It's just that the Byzantines are essentially more trained, and they have also, logistically speaking, in fact, they have an edge at one point that is enough to, in this struggle for resources that the war is sucking away from the peninsula, by the way, is everything. right? But you can't say, in my opinion, like that the fact that the Byzantines were they had a superior cavalry in terms of equipment. I'm not so sure it was the case, right? In terms of actual proportions of troops fighting in a certain way, it's possible the Byzantines had, like, that they invested kind of in a higher quality of let's say there was a higher number of people who had a better equipment, but this meant they also probably had less of that containment elements of the Germans. But it's also speculative, and the real difference is really collective training. The Byzantines could perform tactics that the Germans couldn't because they didn't have the necessary training, collective training, right? But this was also compensated in part, as we've seen, by also actually a moral force that the Germanic mindset we now had, in the sense that these guys had come through out from the myth grinder, like, so that they were kind of, if you look even at the art of these peoples, you realize what their vision of the world was. It was about, people torn apart and devoured by snakes and giant universal snakes, and violence and death and evil. In the actual, like, it was a value. It was considered. Look at Longobard stories and art. That was what their mindset was. That the stronger had to prevail, and it was all a military struggle. So these guys were fanatically courageous, and the Byzantines recorded this in the Strategicon. They wrote that these guys went on like disorderly. On fighting, etc., but they were absolutely courageous and fanatic. The author says as if they were the only people in the world to be courageous, right? Which doesn't mean exactly that they were, but they thought themselves to be. This is a quite a fanatic attitude, and that's what brings you to essentially, get yourself killed in the name of something that maybe, a Byzantine mindset were kind of more secularized or kind of rationalized, and these guys didn't. But as we know, the Gothic War, we know how it's gone, and yeah, the Byzantines won, especially at the beginning, fairly easily, but, eventually it turned out into a mess, right? So whatever happened, and we don't also clearly understood everything cent for cent, but realized that the individual training or certain tactical solutions that were adopted in terms of equipment, I don't think are the real explanation here. There is also this idea, in fact, that there was an ultra specialization, like a sum of for example, of lance and archery. Let's talk about that, because we actually know that this was a model that did exist, historically speaking. And I'm talking about actual heavy cavalry, equipped both with lance and bow. Now, this stuff is to be found very interestingly in the steppes, like essentially a sort of elite and possibly also medium cavalry. I mean, these were abilities were quite widespread among the nomads of the steppes. But historically speaking, this tactical subdivision on the long run was to end. You find this even, for example, in the early, like in the Persian warfare. Like, there was this original subdivision, and for especially during Parthian times, or also a bit later, of actual combination of these two elements, for as if you had a cavalry that could do the same thing of softening up the enemy ranks with archery and eventually charging. Like, this is in part, like, this didn't stand a chance. Actually, we know the models eventually split it in two. Like, you have either horse archers or lancers, because you need to functionalize this on a broader scale, and on kind of pitch battle level tactics that involve the need by themselves simplification of the tactical roles. So this wasn't actually I don't think even in the Byzantine Empire this was effectively attained, if not in the sense that, of course, Byzantine cavalrymen could use lance and bow, but that didn't necessarily happen on a large scale in actual pitch battles. Like, and the same goes for the Goths. I personally believe that they could do exactly the same thing individually, but then what you do as a collective formation is it must be differentiated, because an entire unit of horse archers that goes back and forth and that does exclusively that is much more effective than a guy that is already heavy with its own armor and also partly horse armor that has to do the same thing. And you know, we know, for example, he can't run for much as a light horse archer can do, that can literally arrive a few meters from the enemy coming back. If you're a lancer, how can you do that? So there is probably like there is a manualistic and didactic and theoretical picture we get from Byzantine manuals that are dramatically accurate and precise, but the reality of warfare, we know it historically speaking, it always happened in a certain dimension. Now, the fact that especially the Italian campaigns against the Goths was so, like, there weren't many fighters. Like, Belisarius invaded Italy with an army of, you know, some 1,000 cavalrymen, and that's it, basically. And the war also was fought, especially in the second phase, with a lot of skirmishes, scorched earth strategy, etc., in ambushes and things like that. That at that point, the individual value of the cavalryman could be reclaimed. Like at that point, yeah. Also, this, you know, handful of, I don't know, of explorers or scouts, etc. You know, they maybe had more importance individually than others had. But if there had been a major pitched battle, we would think that would function like way more, you know, selectively in terms of individual specializations. So this is all for saying that, in my opinion, all these differences, aside from, you know, small technological, you know, differences and influences, like objectively, the Roman army did have a lot of influence from the steppe, and kept having it, like especially in the Eastern Roman Empire. This kind of Pontic and Near Eastern dimension is, you know, that they received a lot of influences from the steppes as well, from the Persian tradition. But even at that point, we actually know that after the destruction of the Goths, what seemingly injected into not just Byzantine but also Western European warfare a lot of kind of, you know, a massive dose of kind of heavy cavalry tactics and kind of technology was the Avar invasion. That really brought something new that it was imported in, you know, in accelerating a process that was already happening by itself. That was the one of, you know, the increasing importance of heavy cavalry, and let's say of cavalry in general. But at the point of the Gothic War, I don't think actually that there were enormous differences, or at least that you can find such things written in the sources, but the reality may be different. And in fact, we have an enormous problem, because in many, think about the dish of Isola Rizza, for example, we don't know was pictured in that scene, because you have basically one cavalryman that is trespassing with his countess, a foot warrior, and there's another foot warrior dead on the ground. Now nobody knows what the hell that is. Like if the cavalryman is Byzantine, is Ostrogothic, is Longobard, nobody knows. The same goes for, actually, the guys on the ground seem to be more like German, like, so they are either Ostrogothic or Longobard warriors. But the concept is that these guys at this point use the same exact weapons. And I mean the same exact weapons. So you can't distinguish them from a Roman cavalry. And they're the same thing. And because most of the times they actually were the same thing. Like, there was plenty of foreigners in the Byzantine army. Lots of Germans, a lot of Turkic, a lot of even North African cavalry. And you can't find as many as that. And not everything is so clearly, you know, classifiable. Like, you can't say these are these and these are that. Those are those. Like, it doesn't work. Like, and I think at this point the only real discriminant is literally just collective training and the amount and precision and efficiency in performing maneuvers on the field. That's literally the only difference. And at that point the Byzantines were better, right? But they were better as long as they were in pitched battles. When other stuff began, you know, they started having difficulties on their own, because actually guerrilla is a strong form of warfare. It's not undefeatable, at all, telling the truth, as many people think, but it's still bringing the situation to kind of 1 versus 1 and not to, kind of leveling the asymmetry. That at this point in history, telling the truth is not that big. As we were saying before, armies were substantially the same thing. You can find these minor differences that can be important, but come on, especially among, at this point, sedentary populations. Like, you can't talk about the Huns and the Avars, for example, as something different from the Europeans, but among Byzantines and Goths, like, I didn't see this great deal of difference, if not an organizational one. Yeah, a collective training, logistical, and a broader organizational, but more than else, political cohesion. Political cohesion, that's it, right? That's it. And there would be a lot to tell about that too, because actually, in the second phase of the war, during Totila, there was this freeing of a lot of slaves, as you probably know, from the Roman latifundia. Basically, Italy, the fact that Italy had remained untouched by devastations largely before the war, and that late antiquity had survived in there, equated that there were like an ultra elite of senators that basically owned like all the land, where all the rest of the population worked like theoretically as freemen, but in practice as serfs, when not slaves. And what happens is when Italy is ravaged by the Gothic War, the armies go back and forth 2 or 3 times. Totila, that revives from northern Italy this counterattack this against the Byzantines. They reconquer almost everything in the peninsula. Had promised actually to all these Roman slaves to be freed and to embrace fundamentally the Germanic egalitarian model. That is what will help dramatically the Longobards to build a kingdom in there, because when the Longobards will arrive, they will find lots of people that are not slaves anymore. They kind of have participated to this broader revolution that, Italy got destroyed in the process, in many ways by the war first, and then by the plague. But essentially, especially in the Apenninic hinterland, aside from the coasts that remained kind of Byzantine in character, but the idea of freeman, the small middle property owner, like, it was already established, and the Goths had contributed to that by essentially bringing all this Italian population from their side, because you said, if the Byzantines reconquered the peninsula, you're gonna be old slaves once again, right? And these guys, they had literally nothing to lose, and they said, okay, we join. And it's quite, I say this because it's quite likely that actually these peoples, now I think during the war, the Goths had lost also their military administration. I mean, it was a total disaster. So it's very likely that actually lots of these freed slaves would actually fight as bowmen, as guys who literally had nothing more than a bow and quiver and a knife. And that, however, in the Apenninic hinterland could do a hell of a guerrilla like that. And also because it was their home. Right, so and they knew the territory and so on. So that's why it was so tough eventually, the second phase of the Gothic War, and why the peninsula got destroyed in the process. But it was a matter of changing a model that paradoxically was fixating, albeit in a completely disastrous situation, what theoretically was the Ostrogothic problem in the peninsula. I mean, the fact there was a senatorial elite in the way that would make them crumble, and that were the guys that technically had phoned Constantinople and say, can you come here and get rid of the Goths, please? And that's how it happened. So actually, it's very fascinating, but this can explain in part also why there were so many archers, or at least so many archers are registered in that war, because in general, from both sides, like, the people who were fighting were quite poor. And this may be a reason. The other reason could be actually a Romanization of an already, fairly archery oriented Germanic character of the Goths, because we know that the Romans made extensive use of archers in their armies in late Roman times. And probably all these distinctions do not even make sense by themselves. I mean, it was also homogeneous that it was pretty easy to make this distinction. So Yeah, and I think that this is what really made the difference on the field on that war. And it's not really sure, by the way, that the Romans in Italy, I mean the Byzantines at this point, I say, in Italy employed against the Goths cavalries that were of equal kind of skirmishing character to the ones that probably the Goths had also matured back there in the steppes or in the Balkans, right? In fact, there were actual Illyrian skirmishers among these, and I don't know, many of them were even descended from the Goths, who knows? We know the same Longobards actually fought for the Byzantines in Italy against the Ostrogoths, and they were even settled in southern Italy before the major migration some time later. There were naturally Asian cavalry, Huns, for example, Turks, parts of those same peoples that will arrive with the Avars in the Pannonian Plain in a few time. And these were hell of fighters. There was even Northern African Berber cavalry that at that point the Vandals had used, that before the invasion of Italy, Belisarius had crushed the Vandals, and we know that the Vandals used Berber cavalry as auxiliaries as much as the Romans did at that point. So it was all blended pretty heavily. And there is no reason to me to stress the differences more than much. We just know that at the beginnings, let's say, of when the Goths, for example, crossed the Danube, like with the Visigoths, etc., they were at disadvantage in certain situations, because first of all, this was a whole people on the march, so there were a lot of people, not just warriors, like women, children, old people, whoever could not find, slaves as well, so the Romans at that point, we know that they harassed them, they cornered the Visigoths at one point. They tried to confine them in areas with little food. They attacked their wagons. They forced them to move on. This happened for a long time. It happened with Silica, with Alaricus, for example. It happened so easily that you can't realize at that point, especially the Visigoths, though, had remained kind of more Central European in character. They hadn't gotten all that big deal of let's say horsemanship that the Ostrogoths had. In fact, actually, as we were saying before, the Huns estimated Ostrogothic cavalry a freaking lot, and it seems, in fact, distinctively, even in battle Catalonian fields as well as in other places, that quite likely the Ostrogoths had much more cavalry than the Visigoths, right? So even actually a few times of separation had that probably already had some previous roots, however, had distinguished fairly homogeneous peoples on the base of this presence of more or less cavalrymen and archers, but let's not exaggerate either. That's just orientatively so. So, as we have observed now, the infantry component, let's say, of Italian Ostrogothic and later Longobard armies included numerous archers. Right? This is quite evident. The point is, we don't know in which measure compared to other peoples, right? We definitely have a great documentation of the Italian Gothic armies thanks to Procopius, for example, and thanks to the fact that the Romans had waged a freaking war in the peninsula, right? You don't have this in Gaul, for example, so we don't know what the Franks were actually like. Yeah, there were a bunch of Franks in Alemannia that descended up to southern Italy after the Goths were wiped out just to have their raiding party. They were crushed by the Byzantines, but that's just a small body of adventurers or people who wanted to loot and so on. You know, in Italy there was a war that lasted for an enormous time, and therefore we get more evidence from that specific war. But this doesn't tell us clearly whether all these references to battlefield archery is actually related to the fact that the Ostrogoths had necessarily at that point more archery, whether it was a steppe tradition, whether it was a local tradition, we don't know. And naturally, we also get the impression in that war that the employment of these troops was dramatically fluid, which, as we also said before, is kind of normal. These guys could mount, dismount, use bow. I mean, the bow, by the way, is something fairly easy to carry with you and to use. So these guys would be normally equipped like with a I mean, the elite Ostrogothic cavalry would go and battle regularly, I think, with a lance, with a sword, with a side weapon like a scramasax or something, and a bow and quiver. Why not? Maybe even something else. But let's not exaggerate either. But I mean, something like lassos, or this could be the thing, real thing. And you understand, conceptually speaking, this warrior can do literally everything. So the need of distinguishing even cavalry from infantry in this regard is relative. Literally, because these were like dragoons, right? The important also was deploying these troops quickly, effectively, and naturally, mounted training troops of guys who can fight both on horseback and mounted and dismounted was okay. Also, there was this general prejudice in the ancient world. It was kind of shared, especially by these kind of primitive-minded peoples, like with the Germans, kind of a egalitarian mindset, that whoever fights on horseback is potentially a coward because he can't run away from the field. And this is something you find in many other contexts. You find in Viking era, you find among the Anglo-Saxons. Hell, you actually find it even among the Celts or the same Romans at the beginning. I mean, actually, the Romans had, contrarily to popular opinion, a dramatically developed equestrian mindset that couldn't be erased even throughout the centuries. But let's say there was always this sense that, of course, was ideal because there was cavalry at all times, and especially the finest warriors very often were cavalrymen because they were the elite, the guys with the most expensive equipment and training and and interests. This is a matter, always remember, Clausewitzian concept. War is not about material objects. War is about moral forces. The guys who are on horseback are most of the times the guys who have more to lose, right? So if you find them fighting, it's because they have a hell of a reason, a commitment to be there. And therefore they were multi-role. Probably the average Ostrogoth, it's a bit different to speak, I don't know, of an Ostrogoth, let's say, of second generation Italy in the 6th century, and, I don't know, Scandinavian of the same period, like a freeman, because they're technically two very different things. They're acquainted with different cultures, they own very different proportions of wealth, so it's difficult to stereotype these people. It's probably say in Italian, among the Italian Ostrogoths, there had been a level of demilitarization by certain standards, simply because they had probably a higher per capita wealth, and they had to deal with things that weren't just war, because Italy was pacified at that point. The actual Ostrogoths had pacified it. So actually, Italy was quite prosperous under the Ostrogoths, and at that point, you relax as well. So these guys are not the guys from the swamps and the forests, right? That they have to fight for eating every single day. These are something very different, and this changes a military culture a freaking lot. But it kind of gets it also more refined under other aspects, right? This stuff happens everywhere. Even if you take, for example, Persia at the same time, and many people are convinced that the Sasanians had, for example, kind of heavier cavalry than the Parthians, but it's the other way around. The Parthians were the guys coming from the steppes, and they maintain the cataphract tradition way more than eventually the Sasanians do. The Sasanians kind of lighten their own troops. Sedentarization doesn't bring them to to and it brings them also to distinguish between kind of heavy troops and horse archers, as we were saying before. So that took actually a lot of time. It took like half of a millennium almost. But you know, certain differences, especially in a place where there is such a great disproportion between the occupants, like the rulers in demographically speaking, and the rest of the population, is also to be felt. It's obvious that the Goths fought during the Gothic War also with Italian levies at that point, not just with Germanic warriors, right? So it's difficult to picture this all, and at the same time, however, there is the understanding that probably there was an increase in professionalization at this point, like especially after the major blows to economy and the plague and destructions, etc. At that point, just a few people can effectively fight over the population, right? Or at least they can be effective fighting force at that point. That also explains why so few fought actually both in Gothic and in Byzantine armies during the same war, who were the actual fighters, because there's a sort of specialization that that point gave, you know, it's also about living off the land. I mean, the Byzantines were fighting, you know, what was theoretically the cradle of the Roman Empire. We're fighting now in a foreign land. Just the senatorial elite of Italy could like Constantinople. The other population didn't give a freaking damn about them. And telling the truth, it's not even the first thing in the first place, because the Latin senators were something very different in mindset, and rightfully so, from the Byzantines ones. It came from a completely different political and social background. But, you know, there are also interests, quite heavy economical interests in common. The reliance on missile fire may very well be an inheritance from the Roman army, right? Out of which we can say that, after all, most barbarian armies evolved, right? We have to be completely honest about this. As we were saying before, the late Roman army too had made heavy use of missile weapons, especially spears and heavy javelins and darts thrown just before contact. And this is what basically the Germans have literally copied. Like the ango is basically derived from the Roman pilum, and the Francisca too is probably actually a late Roman weapon, not a Frankish one, not even a Germanic one, because telling the truth, the Francisca is in no way typically Frankish. It's all the Germans used it, and it seems it was more likely a kind of a Western thing, and more in general, this kind of heavier equipment for smashing armor is, in my opinion, just the fruit of the contact with these poorer populations that normally didn't have much of an armored elite with this other Mediterranean, but not only, even Celtic populations. Like, so it's important because even the Goths of the origins, given that objectively they were counted the furthermost from the Roman frontiers at that point, but it doesn't make sense either, because they fared, they traveled far and wide. They fought for the Roman army as mercenaries and so on, as well as against the Roman army on the Danube, on their seas actually. So it's obvious that the Germans grew old with Celtic and Roman military culture, and they effectively put it in use against the same Romans at some point. Especially in equipment, you can see that there are dramatic differences, striking differences between the two. Naturally, there are changes over time, right? The battle, for example, in the 5th and 6th centuries seems to have been rather different from that after about 600, right? Formations, though still fairly dense, have been rather looser than later, and to enable rapid charges and throwing of this array of weapons and the use of the small shield, right? There are peoples, for example, like the Anglo-Saxons, that had consistently smaller shields than other Germans apparently, for the archaeological finds, they also had much less archery than we find in these Eastern Germans, which is very interesting as well. And not to say that even the Anglo-Saxons, the continental Saxons that eventually migrated in Britain, were fundamentally that far from peoples that eventually were famous for their cavalry and archery, such as the Longobards, for example. Actually, the Longobards are not terrifically, like, yeah, there are many hints that they had lots, kind of consistent amount of archery, but even in there we don't have proof that how widespread it was, right? And going a bit more in detail, we actually get from Procopius' account of the Byzantine campaigns in Italy that Ostrogothic warriors were commonly equipped with bows, for example, and that their archery could be significant, right? So this is still of a Roman historian actually stating that, yeah, the Germans, these Germans particularly can do also this, right? And this is important because as we're, there was probably the perception that these peoples were also kind of closer to them. The Goths were some of the most Romanized peoples, especially the Visigoths among the Germans. I mean, the Ostrogoths a bit less, but they were substantially so. I mean, Theodoric had been grown old in Constantinople. There was a consistent Romanization, but I mean also the relations in the Balkans were fairly close. So there was probably this idea that, I don't know, the Anglo-Saxons or the Franks were kind of more distant in some way. In fact, in my opinion, when you read the Strategicon, that is the major source on these, let's say, military and ethnographical topics in the late 6th, possibly the beginning of 7th century, you sense, many people say, there is this chapter, I also made a video about it, that is on the blonde-haired peoples. Maybe I will have to remake it because it was a very old video. And it says simply blonde-haired peoples, and it doesn't specify who he's talking about. It's interesting because from one side he even treats the Slavs, for example, and the Anti, right? And the Slavs also were pretty kind of blonde. So you understand, this is, classicism, or, there was this idea, even the Romans nicknamed, like they gave cognomina to the Germans in their army and administration, like Flavius, because they were stereotypically blonde and, all this stuff. But many people say, this guy is talking about the Franks, preferably. The question is, why? Actually, the Byzantines had just finished to destroy a major Germanic population like the Ostrogoths. Now they were actually fighting pretty intensely, and actually together with the Franks that were from the other side, with the Longobards that they also hired in massive numbers. They sent thousands in Armenia. They had them in the Balkans fighting against the Avars in other population. I mean, it was plenty of them. Why should they be the Franks? To me, it's more likely that they were referring, even if anything geographically speaking, thinking about even just the empire, how it was located at that point in the east, about the Eastern Germanic branches, right? The Longobards and the Goths, that's what they had in mind. The Franks were literally the ones that the Byzantines had least contact in common at that point, possibly just with the Visigoths, and of course the Anglo-Saxon, but let's say the ones we had an actual contact with, and that is documented at least. So we should think about it. We should think about the fact that there was probably an interiorization of this picture of the Germans that was more based on the eastern part of them than the western one. And this is still a speculation, but at least it's kind of a better one than the usual that you hear. So there are also the twins, let's say, of the Goths, of the Ostrogoths, that are the Visigoths, right? So Visigothic society, now we don't have time to distinguish it from the Ostrogoths. There are important differences. The Ostrogoths were objectively the older brothers, right? At least they were the more powerful, but at some point they extend even formal control over Visigothic Spain, etc. Because they felt they were akin with each other. They were both Aryan at that point, so they were fighting in the picture against the Franks and the Byzantines that were Catholic. So the Gothic War is very important also for these broader international reasons, and also religious policy and military control. We made a lot of videos about this topic. But we know from Visigothic law that archery was fairly important. For example, slaves brought to the army were to be equipped with bows. The same thing you find actually here. They are talking still about slaves. Eventually, in early medieval times, basically every single army will, in the not just in the Romano-Germanic West, but actually all around the Mediterranean, in whichever kind of recruiting system we can study. I mean, there was this lower stratum of the population who had to be equipped with bows. This is evident even in the in Longobard Kingdom of Italy, where the recruitment laws that were emanated in the late 8th century by the King Aistulf suggest that warriors who did not own a horse should bring a bow, which actually we're talking about 2 centuries later, and this was still the case, right? So this actually, at this point, the Longobards were fully integrated, mixed. Like here, a Longobard is the average inhabitant of the Longobard kingdom, and therefore you find that archery is still that widespread, because we know that many people would fit economically in that class that is based on census, that has to provide bow and quiver for war. And the same actually is proved by Carolingian Frankish capitularies, right? That imply that archery featured in their tactical planning. So this was the normality, and at this point we actually don't know so much, let's say, about the before, like, because for the ancient world we don't have this recruiting information. Like we don't know what the tribes normally organize themselves like. We know about the Romans that had archery quite widespread at some point, but we essentially don't see whether this was the need of having the lower class equipped with these troops, either from the obvious functionality of having a cheap and large pool of recruitment for this kind of support fire that is important on the field, was a consequence of the migration era proper. It was simply what those systems in early medieval Europe would naturally provide by themselves in those particular situations, and after the settlement and the mix of the Germans with the rest of the populations, well, I think the latter option is pretty obvious. Like there was no. This is not about culture. This is actually about politics, society, economics, technology. That's the combination you get. So we get definitely that both the Visigoths and the Longobards required the provision of warriors with bows, and we have therefore no reason to, with all the hints that we have collected, to think that this was not true for the Ostrogoths as well, right? And we have actual evidence, as we were saying before, that in the early 6th century, from a letter from the court of Theodoric himself, the reference to the training of young archers by royal officers, which means that Italy, I think this could be possibly in Ravenna, and was the capital, was the Ostrogothic court was recruiting young archers, right, through the supervision and the organization eventually of royal officers. So this is very important, because we are, we're not extremely distant from the Gothic War, but that still has not much to do with that, and therefore we know that this kind of troops was important enough to require royal officers taking that into their hands, taking that matter into their hands. It's quite important, in my opinion. So Ostrogothic armies also included apparently large numbers of dismounted bowmen specifically. On occasions, these were rapidly outdistanced by their mounted forces. This was a problem for tactical coordinations, right? And albeit Procopius says that these the Ostrogothic cavalry entered battle protected by what he calls their hoplites, right? That is hoplitai, I imagine in Greek, which is literally the infantry, the kind of a spearmen with shields, close fighting foot soldiers. So this is interesting because it shows probably certain tactics were performed like that that are important to picture. Like, first of all, we have seen how infantry was important still at this point. Like, cavalry is not really prevalent, tactically speaking. So there was a lot of archery involved, and a lot of attacks, counterattacks, feints, feint flights, etc. So the Ostrogoths had probably a consistent amount of cavalry, but not this excessive much. And when you don't have that excessive much, the bulk of your troops is infantry, right? Substantially. And you want to protect your cavalry in some way. So either you place them on the wings, where they have regularly to outmaneuver, outflank the enemy, or you can also create corridors among the units that are spaced for excuse me, we don't know much, but every unit has its own space, that for which you can make them retreat within the infantry ranks. This is very important because it's not such an obvious tactics, right? Even especially considering that battles tend to be simple in their development. Like, especially in terms of command, you need to simplify things over time. Byzantine manuals actually speak of Byzantine cavalry performing dramatically sophisticated and complicated maneuvers that we don't know how much they actually functioned on the field. Probably they did. I mean, we can be skeptical about, it was in this Byzantine treatises already this vein of, Hellenic idealism popping out of the mostly pragmatic kind of Latin mindset of the Romans. Excuse me. But it's still possible that after all, Ostrogothic tactics were similar in that regard. I mean, that were much more, disordered, as we've seen before, because they lacked collective training in the same measure the imperial troops did. But at the same time, the fact, especially that they had to take shelter behind infantry, speaks of, troops that went back and forth that needed to, because cavalry normally, cavalry cannot defend by definition. So either you use it for offensive reasons, either charging or skirmishing, or you can't do much with it. So the fact these guys had to retreat at that point behind the infantry lines is by a predetermined, like, an apparent habitual use, as the source puts it here, is indicative of fights that are pretty, where cavalry is dynamic, but not at the point that you throw it all against the enemy. It's mostly kind of skirmishing troops, probably horse archery as well, right? Which is very likely, telling the truth. And the advantage of that is naturally that horse archery can run in front of the enemy, which is usually it can be either cavalry, of course, but it's also infantry, and you shoot the bow at close range, and then you retreat, and that's what you're supposed to do. Like, he's not throwing at a distance like foot soldiers that are on foot, and they can be slaughtered by cavalry if caught in open field, right? So usually archers shot from the back of or the flanks of the formation, right? Sometimes mixed even with cavalry. Actually, we know we have seen at Battle of Strasbourg, for example, that even javeliners were mixed with Germanic cavalry, and they were actually effective. In that specific occasion, they were quite effective against Roman cataphracts that were routed by this combination. And that speaks to you also about maneuverability. Like, you don't need heavily heavily armored shock cavalry just thinking that it will work all the time, right? And this back and forth speaks of a war of attrition that is typically the one depicted by, in fact, by the same Procopius in the Gothic War. And we can think actually that the same infantry, I mean the hoplites, as Procopius calls them, in the Ostrogothic army was equipped with bows as well, right? It is possible actually, this tactical specialization, which actually makes a bit more sense than, let's say, the cavalry one, because infantry has to be largely static and exposed to enemy fire. I mean, it's really the bulk that takes most of the hits, probably, unless the archers do not target specifically other cavalrymen usually. But we know from the Strategicon that the Germans had pretty clear in mind the idea of having a compact shield wall that could, that eventually that's what they charged with. And therefore it's possible that these guys, or at least someone from the posterior ranks, would, throw momentarily the spear down and starting using the bow, right? There would be nothing strange about that, but would increase firepower. It was actually done by the same Roman infantry, albeit in that case it was also a bit more of tactical separation of the two elements, tactical specialization. But in general, we know that the Romans did this specific kind of double role as well, and it fits the picture, right? What else? We know, for example, at the Battle of Busta Gallorum, Totila, king of the Ostrogoths, ordered his warriors not to use spears or bows, but to rely on their swords. Now, this is terribly important as an information because it kind of confirms what we just said, that Gothic warriors could serve as close fighting troops on foot or horseback, or as archers, depending on the occasion. This is fantastic because it really reveals a great level of individual training, at least, right? And possibly, we haven't insisted on this, but it's possible that, when the Goths occupied Italy and they started managing the peninsula in its military resources and armory production, so they started having also logistics from their own side. We know that they didn't make a terrific use of it, but they functionalized probably their army more than. I mean, there is no comparison here between an Anglo-Saxon army of the 6th century and an Ostrogothic army of the 6th century. The latter was dramatically more advanced and dramatically more Romanized in this sense. So this is particularly important to stress. And it's also interesting that the use of swords here for actual, for fighting to the death, like in this battle, and that is something you find when you have assault troops. The other day I was translating a text in which, of the 14th century actually, that speaks about a battle, which is exactly this thing, that there were certain infantry equipped with spears, and they wanted to attack cavalry, but they couldn't maneuver the spears in the fray, in the midst, because they actually were fighting against under infantry at some point. So they threw their spears, and they assaulted cavalry with swords. Now this is very interesting because it's kind of unusual to hear, but this is typical usually of troops who have a bit more of training than the others, a bit more of capabilities, etc. And all the fact that this Ostrogothic troops could use so many weapons during the Gothic War, up 2 generations after their settlement in Italy, is still remarkable, because it probably speaks about a good level of training after all. That it was not enormously different from the one of the Byzantines as well. I think it's very, very important. These guys grew, right? They grew a lot. This is not an early Germanic army. This is kind of a pretty damn advanced thing, right? But they messed up politically, and socially, so that's why they did bad. But militarily speaking, they weren't probably that, aside from logistics and organization, they weren't probably that bad as, tactically speaking. That's very important to stress, with the obvious realization that, of course, logistics and organization does have an impact on tactics as well, because you can't do certain things if you don't have enough resources. But these guys proved to be actually held troopers. These actually had fought throughout all the second phase of the war, and probably also throughout the first one. They were veterans from now a prolonged fight. And when there are very long wars in areas that, that's where professionalism kicks in. Because this is not a border frontier between, kind of the hours of the Byzantines. They all come back home where they belong after the war. This is about an area that is your home, that has local resources. This is not the Balkans that got depopulated and not, kind of depressed. This is still a functional area that's getting destroyed, but there are people who who have matured in this, that are veterans, that can, they're the relics essentially of this civilization that has been destroyed by the war, and that's quite thought-provoking after all. So these were the hints that you realize are very, very few to tell us what and how much the Ostrogothic archery was actually like, and we can't know that more, right? And that's why the other day I was making this video about the problems of interpretation in migration era equipment, because for example, these people, for its own misfortune, because it got destroyed in the process, was pretty well documented by Roman historiography. We can't say the same thing about the Anglo-Saxons, we can't say this about the Thuringians, we can't say this about the Scandinavians, right? So we can't say that a lot actually even about the Visigoths after all, or some of the Longobards. I mean, it's important to frame this in its geographical and temporal dimension, because eventually, after the 6th century, there was a big crisis all over the world. Even the Byzantine Empire shrinks, as we know. So many of these peoples fall out of the radar of Roman historiography. That, by the way, it transitions, it becomes something different, it declines overall. It pops out once again towards the 8th, the 9th century in a different way. So it's very complicated actually, and today I hope to have given a bit of a functional explanation, kind of a useful explanation about this all, and advise never fall into mechanicistic, technologistic, and culturalist, and if not worse, interpretations, because everything was much more fluid we think it was, right, and much less stereotypical. But we need a bit of that if we want to even to talk about something in the first place. So I think this was a good way to start about it. Of course, we will in the future. I plan to actually discuss all of the all these kind of troops of every single migration era army, as well as in other periods in the Middle Ages and the ancient world. So we will cover it. I'll cover the rest at one point. We will talk about Ostrogothic cavalry specifically at one point, right? Okay. Now I just think about cavalry. I think I forgot something about. Okay, well, it's not a big deal. I mean, the fact, even consider today we didn't talk about cavalry, but think about even the horses. I mean, horses here were an enormously precious asset, and Italy probably didn't have many. Like, probably the Ostrogoths arrived with their own share of cavalry, then eventually they tried to but Italy is not a. I mean, Italy has fine horses, but not many. It's not lands suited for large breeding of horses, but it's that was probably a problem, because surely certain Ostrogoth, especially the elite, etc., was used to fighting that way, and they didn't kind of develop this thing further. Maybe also because of absence of horses. There was a problem also in other areas of Europe, telling the truth. So it would be interesting also to go a bit deeper. I know a guy, a colleague of mine, who wrote a master thesis about the Ostrogothic army in this period here. So I'll have to ask him. Maybe he will provide for us some information, extra information. Alright, but for now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.